Hello, everyone. This is Seraphim Hamilton. Uh, this is today's live stream, obviously. So sorry I wasn't here on Wednesday. Wednesday, I wasn't feeling very well. On Monday, I was on Sam Shamoon's channel talking about the procession of the Holy Spirit. So with Sam's permission, I'll be re-uploading that to this channel at some point in the near future. We had a good about 2-hour discussion on the subject of the Orthodox teaching on the procession of the Holy Spirit and the Orthodox critique of the Roman Catholic doctrine on the Spirit's procession. But today, what I want to talk about in this stream is Mormonism. Those who have been familiar with my stuff for a while know that I have a rather peculiar interest in Mormonism, but I have a peculiar interest in Mormonism because it's a rather peculiar religion. And I don't mean that in this context, at least in a negative sense. Mormonism is peculiar because it is quite small. It's only about 16 million people. Nevertheless, it has an extraordinarily outsized presence in the popular consciousness. The only other religious tradition, at least in the West, that I can think of, which has that kind of outsized presence, is Judaism. There are, as far as traditional Judaism goes, probably around 10 million or less practicing Jews. Nevertheless, Judaism is considered one of the major world religions. Mormonism is also peculiar because it is so different from traditional Christianity in all sorts of radical ways that it provokes those of us within the traditional Christian world to consider the nature of our teaching about God, creation, man, and so on and so forth, and to understand those teachings better in dialogue with Mormon objections to those teachings. Another reason Mormonism is so peculiar, I think, is because it's so radically empirical. Um, it makes the claim that in ancient America there was a substantial Hebrew-based civilization, which in principle should have left a large archaeological footprint. And it's extraordinary because, quite frankly, Mormons have produced, I think, relative to the nature of the claims, quite a surprisingly intellectually robust case for the historicity of something like the Book of Mormon, and for the credibility of certain of their claims about antiquity. Now, obviously, in the end, I don't believe that the Book of Mormon is an historical text, but I think it is a mistake to just dismiss LDS scholars. LDS stands for Latter-day Saint. LDS scholars as not real scholars or something like that. And for me personally, Mormonism constitutes an important check on my own thinking about Christian truth claims. Insofar as, LDS scholars are very intelligent, they are well acquainted with their disciplines, and yet, in my view, they are radically wrong about quite large things. And as a traditional Christian, and if you're a traditional Christian, this is, I think, important to recognize, we also make claims which are quite intellectually radical in relation to what is considered to be acceptable within the mainstream of academic culture. And myself in particular, I know many of you don't necessarily share this. Myself in particular, I hold things which are at least as ridiculous to a mainstream secularist as is the historicity of the Book of Mormon, or more ridiculous. So, for example, I think the world is about 6,000 years old. I'm not sure that young age creationists, most of them, are really aware of the degree to which that is perceived as just lunacy. And so when I look at arguments for the historicity of something like the Book of Mormon, or for the antiquity of the LDS scriptural text, the Book of Abraham, it provides an important check on my own thinking about certain radical claims that I would make, because if I notice that my own arguments start to look structurally like LDS arguments, well, then I have a problem, because that is how a really good argument for a radically false position ought to look. Um, And I think also, LDS scholars are quite right in drawing certain parallels between their own arguments for the historicity of the Book of Mormon and certain, I don't know what you would call them, mainstream conservative arguments for something like the historicity of the Book of Exodus. So I wouldn't consider myself a mainstream conservative on the historicity of the Book of Exodus. I would consider myself quite radically conservative in that I don't shrink from the idea that there were really 2 million Israelites who left ancient Egypt. But this means you can't minimize the Exodus narrative. You have to find a destruction of Egyptian civilization at the appropriate time, if in fact this is an historical text. I mean, when you just look at the biblical testimony about what the Exodus did, what the book is describing is a complete annihilation of Egyptian civilization. And it's an annihilation which is remembered centuries later by the Philistines and which had been heard about by the Canaanites. There's no way that Egypt just kind of goes on after something like the plagues in the Exodus occurs. And so that's why I think you need a revised chronology. Well, attempts by, and I respect James Hoffmeyer, I should say. I don't want to insult him or minimize his contribution. But if you just look at the kinds of arguments for finding a historical Exodus in the 19th dynasty by a gentleman like James Hoffmeyer, it really resembles to me the kinds of arguments that a gentleman like John Sorensen would make for the historicity of the Book of Mormon. In other words, the strategy is principally textual. The strategy is not so much archaeological. It's about minimizing what the text does and doesn't say. So you need to do this if you want to find an Exodus within the 19th dynasty, because the 19th dynasty goes on after the alleged date of the Exodus, according to Professor Hoffmeyer. And so you need to have a relatively small Exodus. And since he's exegetically conservative, you can't just say the text is wrong. You have to find a way to minimize the text. In any case, for a whole variety of reasons, I find Mormonism. I should set my camera up from a higher angle. At the moment, I'm just trying to figure out the logistics of that. Let's see. Okay, this is the best you might get for today. But yes, by God's will, at some point in here, I'm going to get a desk, and hopefully that will resolve some of the issues. Give me a sec. Here, the dog is right here, so okay. Okay. Anyway, so those are some kind of broad reasons why I find Mormonism to be so interesting. So for those who are not familiar, I want to look at, first of all, what is Mormonism? Many of us are familiar with it, but only in really a superficial sense. I'm not sure that most people, even people who are critical of Mormonism, quite understand the nature of its theological system. And second of all, what does LDS academic culture look like? Because this is really underestimated. There is a lot of quite astute Latter-day Saint scholars out there. Okay, so Mormonism makes the claim that in 1820, a young man named Joseph Smith, who lived in upstate New York, encountered the variety of Christian teachings about God and man and sin and all of that. Sorry about the dog snoring. And he became distressed at the theological diversity which he had encountered. And so he reads a passage in James where it says, if anyone need wisdom, let him ask God, because God gives without measure. And so he goes into the woods. This is a place called the Sacred Grove in upstate New York. And he prays about the diversity of churches. And God the Father and Jesus Christ are said to have appeared to him, told him that all the Christian churches are corrupt, and that he is to join none of them. And then Joseph Smith returns home, and 3 years later, he is in his bedroom, and he's praying, and an angel named Moroni appears to him, and Moroni tells him that in a hill near his home, there is buried a book shaped like a codex, engraved on golden plates. And on this book, there is engraved a history of an ancient American civilization of Hebrew extraction. That is an ancient American civilization which is Israelite in origin. And that the recovery and translation of this book will initiate the eschatological process, which will ultimately culminate with the regathering of the tribes of Israel and the second coming of Jesus. So in 1827, Joseph says that he recovers the golden plates and he translates them using, he says, the interpreters, the Urim and Thummim, or seer stone. That's an issue on the historical record. He translates them into what we now know as the Book of Mormon, which records the exodus of a family of Israelites from the tribe of Joseph, the tribe of Ephraim in particular. They leave Jerusalem at the time of its destruction. They sail to the Americas. In the Americas, their civilization divides into two parts, one of whom is begins as righteous. These are the descendants of Lehi's son Nephi, the other of whom becomes evil, the descendants of Lehi's son Laman, as well as Lemuel. And then the Book of Mormon records the conflicts between the Nephites and the Lamanites, the reconciliation between those two parts of Lehi's family with the coming of Christ, but then ultimately the disintegration of that reconciliation, the resumption of war between the descendants of Nephi and the descendants of Laman. Ultimately, that culminates with the destruction of the Nephites, and the last portions of the Book of Mormon describe how the history of the Nephites and the Lamanites is engraved on metal plates, abridged by a person named Mormon, who gives the records to his son Moroni. Moroni then abridges another record, which records the history of the Jaredites. The Jaredites are descendants of a group of families whose language is preserved. They have their original Adamic language preserved supernaturally, and then they emigrate to the Americas. But ultimately, they destroy themselves by constant warfare. And then Moroni writes the last book in the Book of Mormon, the Book of Moroni, which is like a guide for church order. And that's the end of the Book of Mormon. So that's what the Book of Mormon then is. Well, after this, Joseph Smith assumes a prophetic mantle. And this is really, I think, what most people don't understand about Mormon theology, which is that the restoration, and even many Latter-day Saints, I'm not sure, have quite understood this point. The restoration that is claimed to have been accomplished by Joseph Smith is not principally a restoration of lost early Christian doctrines. It's not even principally a restoration of the church as it existed in Christ's day. Joseph Smith understands himself to be God's instrument in the restoration of all things. That is, all of the ordinances that had been present in ancient times during all of the varying dispensations are brought back into force. So that's why he has to go back and have these records about Adam, and go back and claim to translate obscure records about Abraham. And that's why he brings back things like polygamy. He's not just claiming to restore something that was associated with Christ, but rather he's gathering together everything which was present in every dispensation. And chief among that process of gathering all these things together is the restoration of priesthood authority. So this is absolutely central in Mormonism. The idea of priesthood authority. The priesthood is called the power of God. And in Mormonism, every worthy male member is ordained to the priesthood. So this is not a professional clergy. To be a priest in Mormonism doesn't mean you're you're running a parish or something like that. It just means you're a worthy male member. And then the crown jewel of what he claims to restore is certain rituals, which he claims go back to Adam, which can only be performed in temples, which guarantee the exaltation of human beings as divine. Everything Joseph Smith does ultimately comes to its culmination in his development of these institutions that are centered on Mormon temples. So this is what the restoration is supposed to principally be about. It's about a restoration of lost priesthood authority, not just a restoration of certain allegedly lost early Christian doctrines. So if you want to understand Mormon theology, I think the best person to read on this is Terrell Gibbons. Terrell Gibbons is one of the most talented and astute and clear LDS scholars of whom I am aware today. He's written a whole host of books. Um, he wrote a book on the Book of Mormon, published by Oxford. It's called By the Hand of Mormon. He wrote 2 books on Mormon theology. I've only read the first one. I mean, it's really an excellently written book. It's called Wrestling the Angel. And this is, he looks at the shape of Mormon theology and the role of theology within Mormonism. And he just connects it all together in a really kind of compelling way that shows you the uniqueness of what Joseph Smith was propounding in relation to the Christianity with which we're familiar. Of course, I'm not LDS. All of these things are found in Joseph Smith's environment, and Gibbons knows this, and points it out. It's not like he's trying to cover it up. But in relation to mainstream Christianity, it's just radically different. And the LDS Church institutionally still thinks that its principal critics are evangelicals. And so they have had this huge media campaign over the past few decades to kind of make themselves look like a mainstream Christian church. And I think Gibbons is right in saying this is just the wrong strategy if you want to get Mormonism out there. The interesting thing about Mormonism is the ways in which it's radically different from mainstream Christianity. Nobody wants just another evangelical church. If they want to be an evangelical, they'll go become an evangelical. Anyway. Okay. Oh yeah, you guys can hear the the dog. Yeah, sorry about that. Someone asked if I would consider Mormonism Gnostic. This is a really interesting question. Okay. I'm debating internally whether I want to address that right now. Here's what well, let me say a few words about the academic culture in Mormonism. And then I'll get to kind of what I think about the shape of Mormon theology and what kind of explains it. Okay, so many people have the impression that Mormonism is a very stupid religion. It's a stupid religion for stupid people. This is not, if you just popped in, this is not what I think. And many people, including shamefully Christians, make fun of things like the sacred undergarments. I mean, let me be absolutely clear. There's no more idiotic criticism for a Christian to make of Mormonism than attacking their sacred undergarments. I mean, the Bible is filled with sacred garments. In early Christianity, you would wear your baptismal garments consistently, and it was about being clothed in Christ. So in LDS theology, when you've received your endowment, okay, this is when you're anointed for exaltation. You're anointed to be an eternal priest and king in the kingdom of God the Father. And you're given these sacred garments, which signify your authority. And you're supposed to wear them under your clothes all the time. And people go, haha, holy underwear. I mean, what substance is there to this criticism besides just laughing about holy underwear? I mean, clothes have meanings in the Bible. Sacred garments, sacred vestments are central to the Bible and to Christian tradition. I mean, give me a break. Anyone who makes that kind of argument needs to really consider, needs to rethink the way that they're arguing. So Mormonism is not a stupid religion for stupid people. Mormons actually, relative to the number of Latter-day Saints that there are, have an incredibly impressive intellectual culture. So let me just put it this way, that contrary to the impressions of those who think that anybody who knows anything about ancient American civilization realizes the Book of Mormon is hooey. Some of the most eminent scholars of ancient America are believing Mormons. So John Clark, for example. John Clark is a Mesoamerican archaeologist. He excavates in Central America. He's presented at FAIR. FAIR is the principal Mormon apologetic organization. He's argued for the historicity of the Book of Mormon. John Sorensen. John Sorensen is a very talented and astute, or was, he recently passed away, a very talented and astute anthropologist who did really groundbreaking work on transoceanic voyages, showing contact between the old and new worlds. Now, most of that work, in fact, was not centered on contact between the Middle East and the New World. It was centered on contacts from other parts of the Old World and the New World. But it was groundbreaking. It was published in the mainstream literature. He collaborated with non-Mormons, and he wrote extensively on the historicity of the Book of Mormon. I don't actually think that people who make criticisms of the Book of Mormon should focus on the archaeological dimension. I'll explain this in a few moments. Or they should only do so in concert with some other factors. The Book of Abraham. Okay, the Book of Abraham is probably it's one of the most serious problems empirically with Mormon scripture, because Joseph Smith he gets these papyri, and he looks at them and he identifies them as the Book of Abraham and the Book of Joseph. That is, Abraham wrote this text, Joseph wrote this text, now we've got the scrolls. And then he claims over a period of several years to translate those. And the text that we have is called the Book of Abraham. It's claimed to have been translated from these scrolls. Now, those scrolls were thought to have been lost. And he also takes these facsimiles, which are kind of Egyptian religious imagery, and then he interprets them. So he makes notes on what the symbols mean, and he publishes those interpretations as part of the Book of Abraham. And the text of the Book of Abraham actually refers to the facsimiles. It says, you'll see this illustrated in what have I included with this book. Those scrolls were thought to have been lost, but then they were recovered in the 1960s, and they include many of the hieroglyphs that are evidently the source of the Book of Abraham, and they can be translated, and they don't yield the Book of Abraham. This is a really big problem. But it should be said that there are professional Egyptologists who do expend a lot of effort trying to defend the authenticity of the Book of Abraham. Now, I don't think as much of LDS Egyptologists like John Gee or Kerry Mulestein as I do of LDS Mesoamericanists like John Clark or John Sorensen. But they are professionals in their discipline, and at least to some degree should be recognized that you need to know something of what you're talking about if you're going to make an argument against uniquely Mormon scripture. So what is the kind of Mormon theology of everything? What do Mormons believe? So I'll give you Joseph Smith's, by the end of his life, this is the vision that he set out, and then I'll make some qualifications on that. Smith articulated a theology where the fundamental principles of existence are twofold. There's matter and there's intelligence. And matter and intelligence are both eternal. In philosophical terms, we would probably say they're both self-existent. And each of us has a core, which is an intelligence, and we're embodied in matter. But our souls themselves are also a kind of matter. For Joseph Smith, the goal of our existence is exaltation. That is, we acquire the divine potential, which is already ours in principle. That is, intelligence can be developed through time and grow into deity. And God the Father himself is a member of the same species as us. That is, God the Father, in Joseph Smith's final theology, was once a mortal human being who lived on another planet or another universe. He served a god above him. And in relation to his god, he progressed from an intelligence to physical embodiment through death and resurrection, and then finally exaltation, where now he co-frames worlds and serves as God to these worlds. So some people have said, oh, he's the God of this planet. Well, I mean, in Mormon scripture, he rules over many planets. But the point is that for Joseph Smith, God has a God above him, and that God probably has a God above him. And then we share in that same process. Eventually, every one of us is meant to grow into the fullness of exaltation, frame worlds, and then elevate others to godhood. And this all contributes to this vast kind of eternal hierarchy, because we are glorifying our God, and he presumably is glorifying his God, and that God is glorifying his God. And it's just going on and on and on and on and on. But fundamentally, every person is a member of this same species who is they're on varying levels of exaltation. So that's Joseph Smith's vision of reality. Joseph Smith's vision of reality is one where we have an innate divine potential. We're of the same basic race as God. And God, in fact, has a wife or wives. This is something that appears in Mormon theology very soon after Joseph Smith's death, but it was articulated by his close associates, and they said that he privately taught it to them. It becomes open proclamation under Smith's successor, Brigham Young. Anyway, well, in modern Mormonism, there's a kind of ambivalence to some of that theology. Not rejection, but kind of ambivalence. The classic couplet, which captures this theology, is as man is, God once was, as God is, man may become. Well, in modern Mormonism, there are some Latter-day Saints who would want to say, no, God has always been God, but he finds himself in the midst of many other intelligences. And it's his desire to elevate those intelligences to his own state of glory. So they preserve in this view the idea that we're of the same species as God, that we can become what God is, but they still want to preserve some kind of eternal primacy that is absolute for the God whom we worship. And where I think this starts to veer into sometimes dishonesty, sometimes it's just ridiculous, is when they attempt to argue that, really Joseph Smith has just been misunderstood, that he didn't really teach that. Well, it's absolutely clear he did teach that. So did Brigham Young and the other LDS prophets. In any case, so everything that Mormons do is oriented towards this goal of exaltation. So the rites that take place in Mormon temples are rites which are kind of embedded into just the structure of existence, that they're such that they're necessary for us to finally acquire exaltation. So God himself is in a sense subject to law. There are certain laws which are just innate to things. They're not expressions of God's nature. They're not derived from God. God lives within this framework of law. But God knows these laws so well that he knows how to exalt people to deity themselves by working with the grain of existence. And this is what the temples are all about. You go through these various rites, and you can therefore return to God the Father and ultimately acquire exaltation. The way that Smith's vision gets developed by Brigham Young is Smith arguably was not as literal about some of this stuff as Young was, but within kind of mainline LDS theology, at least until relatively recently, You start out as an internal intelligence. That intelligence is then begotten by God the Father and his wife, or one of his wives, into a spirit person. So you acquire then your spirit, your intelligence and your spirit. You live with God the Father, but you need a physical body in order to acquire exaltation, because for Mormons, corporeality is part of divine nature. And so you live with him premortally. You pass through the veil of forgetfulness, and you acquire your physical body. That's where we are right now. And that is necessary because, according to LDS theology, in order to have goodness, you need to also have evil. There needs to be, as the Book of Mormon says, an opposition in all things. So we have to go through what they call a mortal probation, where we have to freely choose to return to our Heavenly Father. So you go through physical embodiment, and you're meant to pass through the ordinances which allow you to be exalted. If you do so, you return to God the Father, and then you serve him. Ultimately, you're resurrected. You spend some time as a servant, as an angel, and then ultimately the fullness of your exaltation is when you become a God yourself. But you're still subordinate to God the Father, because every time you climb up one rung, he also climbs up one rung. So the fundamental, I think, core of LDS theology is the idea that there are these laws, that there are these patterns of existence which are not rooted in a personal God. They're just inherent in existence itself. And these laws thus allow things to be altered and manipulated by those who know the laws really well, such that they can realize their purposes by working with the grain of these laws of existence. That is really, I think, the core idea in Mormon theology. And it's radically different than Christianity, for which all existence is an expression of that which is eternal and infinitely present in the mind of a personal God. So for Christianity, creation is a contingent reality. It doesn't have to exist. It is totally dependent upon God. And all things which exist according to a particular pattern, i.e., the laws of nature, exist according to that pattern because the pattern itself reflects something which is perfectly present in God's mind. So there you have, I think, the fundamental disjunction. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause right here. And I want to just advertise something real quick. I am going to be offering, beginning in mid-January, a class over 6 weeks. That's going to be 12 classes of about an hour each on answering Protestantism from the Bible, looking at Orthodox and, to a large degree, Catholic teachings on priesthood, the veneration of saints, theosis, justification, scripture, tradition, all of this kind of stuff. Over 12 classes, so about 12 hours total. We're going to be looking at that. And you can sign up for that class at the link I am about to. Well, unfortunately, that link is way too long. So let me see if I can actually get you the link in a shorter form. You can find it through Stripe. Hold on. I'm going to link the thing to you in 1 second. One forward. You can sign up for it. It's $120 for again 12 classes. You can attend live, and you can participate in discussion live. But of course, I'll also be providing recordings to everyone who signs up, whether or not you were there live or not. Okay. Okay, here. For its sake. How in the world, honestly? Okay, I'm just gonna tell you what I'm gonna do. So frustrating. I'm really done with this kind of stuff. Oh, for heaven's sake. I have no idea how to do this. I have to create a shortened URL. But apparently, some of them. There we go. Freaking heck. Okay, here. Here. That should work. There we go. Okay. So at that link here, let's see. Okay. I'm going to pin this. Okay. There. At the pinned link, you can. I think you actually have to manually copy paste the link in because I'm dumb and don't know how to do anything. At the pinned link, you're able to sign up for the class on answering Protestantism from the Bible. Again, you can sign up at any point. It's $120 for 12 class sessions in total, each of which will be about an hour long. You're able to participate live. You're also able to watch the recordings, which I'll provide to everyone who has signed up. So please consider doing that. If this is successful, I'm going to be doing more classes in the future. So I'm looking forward to it. I've had one person sign up so far, but we've got a couple. A couple months before it starts, but I would like it if people signed up. If you're planning on signing up, I'd prefer it if you do it earlier rather than later, just so I get some idea of how many people are going to be showing up. Oh, wait, I think I actually have a better, maybe. Oh, there we go. That's better. Okay, finally found a proper way to link this. I would love to do something on talking to Protestants on Clubhouse. I'll try to set that up. Okay, so let's talk about Mormonism again. So the interesting thing about what I've about the core of Mormon theology being that there are these kind of innate principles to reality which just exist, and God himself is subject to these principles of reality. He's not its master, he's not its source, he's subject to these principles, he abides by them, he is God because he abides by them, and we can be elevated to godhood because we learn from him how to be subject to these same principles. The interesting thing is the way that this seems to coincide with the kind of philosophical core of, what you might call a magical worldview. Um, at the heart of the so-called magical worldview is the idea that there are certain just patterns or principles to reality which are inherent in things, and you can manipulate those to realize your purposes. And the gods are quite good at manipulating them. But what the gods are doing and what a magician is doing is not fundamentally different in nature. It's just different in degree. Now, Joseph Smith was very much immersed in magic. So I think there is some evidence that the Smith family was an old kind of magical family, that they were involved in some pretty strange esoteric things going back a number of generations. There are some Smith family documents which are occultic in nature. Um, there were affidavits that were published by his neighbors who knew him before he became the Mormon prophet, who talk about them doing strange things. Like, I'm not necessarily saying this happened, but there is an affidavit which says they did things like animal sacrifice. And what's not disputed is that Smith had a reputation as a treasure digger. So, in kind of upstate rural New York, this thing was not uncommon. Smith had a seer. He actually had multiple seer stones. And he claimed that when he looked in the stone, he could see things. He could see someone's house, maybe from a distance. He could see buried treasure, and he would know how to get to buried treasure. Now, when people point this out, people very often just say this as if it demonstrated that Joseph was a self-conscious fraud. But I think it's more complicated than that. So, obviously, I am not a naturalist. I believe in all sorts of paranormal stuff. Some of the paranormal stuff is diabolical. Some of it is just paranormal. Some of it just, the human mind is much more interesting than a naturalist thinks that it is. There's no evidence that Joseph Smith ever found anything with his seer stone in terms of buried treasure. There are a number of witnesses who report that he was able to do things like remote view through his seer stone. So when he looked in the stone, for example, he saw a particular house which he was supposed to go to. And people who had just come from that house knew that he was describing it accurately. I believe there's one account where this is a really interesting thing, where he looks into his stone and he sees a book that is actually on the other side of the room, and he's able to read word for word from that book. That's really interesting in terms of the dictation of the Book of Mormon. Now, do I think that the stone has inherent power? No. But there are some very interesting studies in the early part of the 20th century done by Andrew Lang on seer stones. And a small percentage of people, when they look in a stone, actually do see something. There's one woman who she looks into a stone, and what Lang reports is she sees a document with writing on it, which is really interesting because Joseph Smith reports that exact phenomenon very soon after he dictates the Book of Mormon. He dictates a document which is supposed to have been written by the Apostle John. He looks into his seer stone and he sees a papyrus written, and he reads out the writing on that papyrus. But Smith is very much immersed in kind of magic and magic culture, which is based on this idea. It's based on the idea that there are these innate kind of principles or laws inherent in reality, which can be manipulated to greater or lesser degrees to accomplish one's purposes. So Smith has a reputation as a treasure digger. People would hire him to find buried treasure. And he would look at his stone and he would locate a place where there was supposed to be buried treasure. And usually that treasure would be guarded by a spirit. And you had to do certain bizarre things to appease that spirit. You had to perform strange rituals or do something unintelligible or arbitrary. You had to appease the spirit. But the spirit was a trickster, and so it might not work. And what he would report looking into his stone. I don't know whether he believed there was treasure there. Maybe he did. I mean, it's not impossible that he really did believe what he was seeing in the stone, or what he claimed to see in the stone, was real. He looked into the stone, and they're digging, and he says the treasure is slipping away into the earth. It's disappearing. The Book of Mormon, its origin story, very much, and this is certainly nothing unique to me, it's almost becoming a bit of a cliche at this point in time, but I think it's true. The earliest accounts of the discovery of the gold plates are very much rooted in this magic culture. Moroni becomes a religious figure later in time. He's called an angel, but remember, for LDS, angels and men are of one species. He's a resurrected person. What becomes an angel and a religious figure starts out, I think, as something like a treasure guardian who appears to the young smith who's a treasure digger. He has a talent with a seer stone, and tells him where this book of metal plates are, a book of gold plates. And there's other things there too. There's a breastplate, there's a sword with a golden hilt. It's a treasure cache. And he goes there, but he doesn't fulfill the requirements for removing the plates. And so one of the earliest accounts of what happens is the Moroni turns into something like a toad and strikes Smith. He's knocked back. I mean, this is just so strange to us, but this is something you'd expect in like magical lore. That is not that's not an angelic type figure. This is a treasure guardian. And then he's told he has to bring his brother with him, his brother Alvin, his older brother, in order to retrieve the plates. The problem is he's told to return the next year with his brother, but his brother dies a couple months later. And then there's this very strange report that Joseph Smith Sr., who's also very into this magic stuff, Joseph Smith Sr. files a report in the newspaper, says he's heard a report that someone has exhumed Alvin's body. And so he went to, and he dug into the earth to see if the body had been exhumed, which is a weird thing to do because, if Alvin was not in fact exhumed, or if he was in fact exhumed, you would see the dirt had been disturbed. If the dirt isn't disturbed, he's not been exhumed. So why does he dig into the earth? Some people have suggested, and I think this is as good a theory as any, that Joseph Smith Sr. Was attempting to retrieve Alvin's body, or a part of it, to bring to the site of the metal plates to appease the treasure guardian to retrieve the plates. I mean, it's a bizarre, quite horrible thing, but it makes sense within that kind of magic worldview at the time. This motif and the idea of sacred metals, of alchemy, and of the significance of buried treasure is all over the Book of Mormon. I mean, the Book of Mormon is quite an extraordinary book. It does have these literary motifs which run through the whole of the text, and which are quite sophisticated. There's intertextuality, and there's a certain complexity to the ways that certain phrases are used. But the themes that are underscored by this kind of intertextuality are themes which are thoroughly rooted in Joseph Smith's mind. So, for example, there's a story in the Book of Mormon where a group of people called the Anti-Nephi Lehis, they renounce their old way of life, which was connected with ritual murder. And they take their swords and they bury them deep in the earth that they may be kept bright as a testimony that we have never used them at the last day. It says the swords are hidden away, but they're going to come forth on the last day. Well, the same language is used of the plates. In the Book of Mormon, the little b Book of Mormon, in the Book of Mormon, Mormon 8, says that Mormon hid up the plates in the earth. And Moroni says the plates are meant to come forth on the last day as a witness. But then it says God is cursing the land. Why? Because there's all sorts of magic that's happening in it. This is then the latter part of Book of Mormon history. God is cursing the land. So what is one of the results of the curse? One of the results of the curse, which is described, is that all of these treasures, sacred metal, lots of metal, is being buried in the ground And people who want to dig it up can't, because it says it is slipping into the earth. This is something which really makes perfect sense in Joseph Smith's context, in terms of his view of things. It does not make sense in terms of an ancient American history. Metallurgy is one of those things which I think is pretty clearly not present in a widespread way in ancient America. Metalworking, in the sense of working kind of raw ores, that's there. But actual refining metals, this appears in the 8th century AD. It's very clear. I mean, there's very clear archaeological kind of signatures that metallurgy appears at this point in time and not earlier. And if those archaeological signatures are recoverable very clearly in the 8th century AD, well, why are they so absent from many of these same archaeological sites earlier in ancient American history? I mean, LDS have attempted to understate or minimize the presence of metalworking in the Book of Mormon. This is a hopeless endeavor. In the Book of Mormon, metals are one of the most central features of Nephite and Lamanite and Jaredite civilization. I mean, you can see this because Mormon himself is not the only plate maker. So Mormon makes metal plates. That is, he doesn't just engrave stuff on them. He actually makes the metal. But his source documents are also written on plates. This is one of those big issues that I don't think Latter-day Saints have really dealt with, which is that, this is not supposed to be a unique thing. This massive book of gold plates. It seems to have been their way of writing everything, or writing huge amounts of things. His source material is said to have been abridged from writing that was engraved on metal plates. Now, this requires just a really robust metallurgically competent society that, from what we can tell, didn't exist. I'm less sympathetic to arguments against the Book of Mormon based on alleged anachronisms like presence of horses in pre-Columbian America. Now, I don't think there were really horses in Central America, but I think the idea that the horse was introduced by the Europeans and that Native Americans didn't use horses, I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. I think the Great Plains Indians always had horses. I mean, their traditions are absolutely clear on this. The horse is absolutely central to the culture of the Great Plains Indians. And, I think it's just ridiculously condescending to kind of lecture them on their own history and say, oh, no, really, the horse has not always been a central symbol to your culture. We gave it to you. And there's a distinct kind of horse whose genetic signature you can see in the western part of the United States, and this distinct kind of horse is reported by early settlers in that region of the country. It's called the ugly horse. It has a distinct appearance to it and everything. Now, it interbreeds with the European-style horses, and its genetic signature is assimilated largely into European-style horses. I do think that there were horses in pre-Columbian North America, at least. But the Book of Mormon actually doesn't mention horses that often, so the emphasis that people lay on it is I think, misguided. I think metallurgy is a much bigger problem. Something about the motif of metal plates that should also be said is Latter-day Saints have made a huge deal of these discoveries of anciently engraved gold plates or metal plates. And this is actually cited by many LDS apologists as one of the most impressive evidences for the Book of Mormon. This is one of the worst arguments for the historicity of the Book of Mormon, because you don't find anything like the thing that is recorded in the Book of Mormon. Remember, when Lehi leaves Jerusalem, one of the first things that he's supposed to do, he's supposed to go to a local aristocrat named Laban and get what he calls the brass plates. The brass plates, obviously, are metal plates, and they include at least the entire Pentateuch, the entire book of Isaiah, other prophetic books, which we don't have, like Zenos and Zenoch, a prophet named Nahum, probably Nahum. This is a huge volume. and it's supposed to have been written in Egyptian, or at least in Egyptian characters. I think the Book of Mormon is talking about Egyptian language. I don't think it's just talking about Egyptian characters. But either way, this is an enormous document. I mean, it's expensive enough to create a scroll with all of this stuff. You'd have multiple scrolls. But imagine engraving the entire content of the Pentateuch, Isaiah, Nahum, Zenos, and Zenoch, however long they were, and more, on metal. You need all the metal. That's super expensive. And then you need someone to actually engrave it, which is just tedious and time consuming. And the only person who could possibly be conceived of as affording something like this is the king. That a local aristocrat has this book, which much of the Old Testament written entirely on metal in Egyptian, it's not really believable. And that's why you do not find in antiquity, nowhere in the world, you do not find books that are written on metal plates. You find small documents that are written on 1 or 2 sheets of metal. Entire texts like that do not exist, so far as we know. The problem with the fact we haven't discovered those books is if Laban had them, of all people, they should not be really that uncommon. Because this isn't something which is a unique treasure which belongs only to the king. This is supposed to belong to some aristocrat. He's wealthy, but he's not the wealthiest guy in town. And metal preserves. Our oldest manuscript of any part of the Old Testament is a little bit of the blessing of Aaron, which is written on metal. I mean, this is like 2 verses. So this is one of those things which is cited as a parallel to the Book of Mormon by Latter-day Saints, but it's just not. If these books really existed in the volume that they need to exist to make the Book of Mormon plausible as an historical account, we should find them. If, in fact, this was the principal way in which the state recorded their annals in ancient Mesoamerica, we should find them. We should find at least some of them. We don't. It's ambiguous whether there's any writing on metal as Mesoamerica, but there's certainly nothing like the vast storehouse of plates which Mormon says that he's abridging the Nephite record from. But here's the really important thing. You don't really have a good parallel to the kind of document that you find in the Book of Mormon from the ancient world. But there are reports in Joseph Smith's time and legends and rumors of books written on metal plates and sealed in stone boxes from his own place. This was something which was in the air. So even if we did find a book of plates from the ancient world, that would solve a problem with Book of Mormon historicity, but it wouldn't, in my view, provide an argument for it. Because the question that we're trying to assess when we assess the historicity of the Book of Mormon is, what production context makes the most sense of it? It is not a question of how many parallels can we create with antiquity, nor is it a question of how many parallels can we create with Joseph Smith's day. The question is comparative. It is which production context better accounts for the information found in the text. So if you have a feature in the Book of Mormon text which appears equally in Joseph Smith's time and in ancient America or the ancient Near East, it's a wash. It is neither an argument for nor an argument against the historicity of the Book of Mormon. The keys are what examples are not a wash. Well, the Book of Mormon, this covers 1,000 years of history. This is a civilization of basically Near Eastern extraction, which lives in ancient America, and they're debating things like universalism in terms which are perfectly intelligible to people in Joseph Smith's day. The theological arguments that they have in the Book of Mormon are theological arguments that they have in Smith's backyard. You have just the very language in which these narratives frame their theology is language which is intelligible to Joseph Smith. And then you have stories which are clearly based in the New Testament. It's not just that a New Testament phrase is used here and there. It's that the whole story is rooted in something which uniquely happens in the New Testament. So, for example, there's a story in the Book of Ether, which is supposed to record the history of the civilization which came out from the Tower of Babel. Book of Ether, where someone dances and pleases the king, and the king offers her half the kingdom, and a head gets served on a platter. This is based on the story of John the Baptist's execution and King Herod. Or you have in the Book of Moroni, you have an exact parallel in the structure of the text itself to Hebrews 11, except it's the Nephite Hall of Faith. It's all of the heroic Nephites rather than the heroic Old Testament characters. This is not a phrase here and there. So some Latter-day Saints have said, well, as Joseph is translating, he is looking to phrases which are very familiar to him, so he uses New Testament phraseology. But it's not just New Testament phraseology, it's the whole structure of these passages. If you did not already believe that this was an ancient document, by any standard of intertextuality, this passage in Moroni is a intertext with Hebrews 11. If that is not, in fact, in reality, an intertext, it raises the question of how can we identify any intertext at all? Because if that doesn't meet the criterion for intertextuality, nothing does. But if it is an intertext, it suggests that the author knew the epistle to the Hebrews, i.e., was not a 4th century ancient American Christian. And it's not one or two examples like this. It's the whole shape and structure and theme of the Book of Mormon is rooted in the world of Joseph Smith. And where it converges with ancient America, it also converges with the understanding of ancient America popular in Joseph Smith's specific subculture. So this is a huge issue I have with LDS apologetics, which is that LDS apologists will say this was absurd in Joseph Smith's day. Nobody would have thought this about ancient America. Well, number one, when they say it's absurd, they're usually talking about understandings of ancient Mesoamerica by Mesoamerican scholars in Joseph Smith's day. But Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon is not about Mesoamerica, unless you're already a believing Mormon. For the non-believing model of Book of Mormon origins, the most relevant context is the Native Americans about with whom Joseph was familiar, and specifically the legends which had grown up around these Indian mountains. There are these burial mountains where you would just see them if you live in the United States in the early part of the 19th century. See them everywhere. They've got obviously burial sites, and there are various artifacts there, and then there are various legends which grew up around them. So in the Book of Mormon, you actually see these massive battles, and then it says that people would heap up bodies in mounds and cover them with dirt. This is an etiology. It's an origin story for these burial mounds. So it's not about Mesoamerica to begin with. So if we're comparing two theoretical models for the origin of the Book of Mormon, one of them, yes, is that this is an anciently engraved Mesoamerican codex written on gold plates, written by a civilization of basically Near Eastern extraction. That's the believing model. But the model I think is true has nothing to do with Mesoamerica. It's that this is an origin story of the Native American Indians as they were present to Joseph Smith in relation to the cultural myth of the Indian burial mounds. And professionals in Joseph Smith's day usually didn't take that idea very seriously. So it doesn't matter what professionals thought was ridiculous, because Joseph Smith wasn't a professional. He wasn't writing for them either. It's about what is in the air. What would have sounded ridiculous to Joseph Smith and those closest to him? So if, in fact, our understanding of ancient America diverges from the scholarly understanding of ancient America in the early 19th century and converges with the Book of Mormon. The question is that also a convergence with popular understandings of ancient America? Does it happen to be the case that in certain instances, the popular understanding of ancient America may have been more accurate than the academic understanding? Well, in those instances where that's true, you would expect a convergence with the Book of Mormon. But the reality is that the narrative, which is tested against the evidence by Book of Mormon scholars, and I have a lot of respect for these people, is not a narrative which is actually found in the text. The Book of Mormon does not, no matter how often people try to find it in the text, it does not have pre-existing Native Americans. Here's an example. When Lehi and his family come to the Americas, their agriculture is described. They plant the seeds that they took from the old world. There is no record of a contact with indigenous Americans. And it doesn't matter how limited your geography is. So Book of Mormon scholars say it took place within a very limited place. It doesn't matter how limited that is. There were indigenous civilizations everywhere. And to argue for the presence of indigenous outsiders in the text, Book of Mormon scholars point to rapid population growth. Well, that only is an argument for the presence of indigenous outsiders if you already assume that it's historical. Of course, the population growth numbers are unrealistic. It's not historical. It doesn't need to conform to to the actual patterns of population growth. It's exactly those kind of things which you overlook if you're spinning out of narrative, if you're not thinking about things like this. If there are indigenous outsiders in the text, you should hear about them. You don't. Not once do you hear about them. There are various arguments that are made for them, but I don't find any of them at all convincing. But whenever you have someone like Sorensen or Brant Gardner, who I have a lot of respect for, comparing the narrative in the Book of Mormon to alleged parallels in Mesoamerican archaeology, what you find is that the narrative that they're comparing to Mesoamerican archaeology is not actually the narrative that you derive textually from the Book of Mormon. Instead, they know Mesoamerica, and when they read the Book of Mormon, they feed this Mesoamerican context into the text, and then they read it out of the text. So here's an example. The Book of Mormon describes Lehi and his family arriving in the Americas, building a city, planting seeds from the old world, dividing into two competing family groups. That's what it describes. It also describes a land which had been kept from the knowledge of other nations so that there would be a place for an inheritance. I don't know how a person reads that and gets the land is already covered with indigenous civilizations. But that's the reading of the text. Now, when Sorensen and Gardner, they look at the archaeology of the 6th century BC in Central America, they find that there's a lot of economic development and stuff at this point in time. And they link that to the arrival of Lehi and his family, because they say Lehi and his family joined with indigenous outsiders and contributed technology and stuff and spurred a kind of a period of rapid civilizational growth. But the problem is that the narrative that they say is historical is not the narrative that you're actually reading from the text. You can get Mesoamerica out of the text when you put it into the text. And I'm not saying that's intentional. I don't think it's intentional. It's in the same way that when you read the book of Acts, you read the conversion of St. Paul, and in your mind's eye, you see Paul on a horse. And so when you describe the narrative in the book of Acts, you describe Paul on his horse. Well, Acts doesn't describe Paul on his horse. He may have been on a horse. He may not have been. But that's how a person can describe a narrative, which they attribute to the text, which actually isn't in the text at all. So I have to... I'm just reading... liquid oxygen. I'm just trying to read. Okay. So I have no idea what the argument in the comments section is about. Finding truth. On chiasms in the Book of Mormon. Some of the chiasms I think are, well, if you look at Brant Gardner's discussion of Alma 36, which is supposed to be one of the most impressive Brant Gardner's an LDS scholar. Gardner ultimately concludes that though there are chiasms in the Book of Mormon, that is not one of them, which is interesting. Some of the chiasms I don't think are real. Some of them I think are just um, a result of the fact that Smith is dictating this orally. But also I think part of the culture of dictation is the memorization of a pre-existing structure. People, I mean, LDS scholars say that chiasmus is a Hebrew literary form. It's not a Hebrew literary form. It's found everywhere. So if you look at this, there's a very interesting book called Visions in a Seer Stone, which talks about the practice of laying down heads. That is, you memorize the structure of a sermon you're about to give extemporaneously. And it can be a long sermon. And then you follow it out systematically after laying down the structure initially. And he finds that in the Book of Mormon. So I think some of the chiasms are real insofar as there's an actual structure there. I would tend to attribute the structure to that. Some of the chiasms are so small that they just spontaneously arise just when you're speaking extemporaneously. But it would depend on what particular example of chiasm a person is pointing to. So I have to get going, but if you are interested in the class on Protestantism, on answering Protestant criticisms of Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and from the Bible, priesthood, justification, marrying the saints, things like that, it's $120 for 12 classes over a period of 6 weeks. You'll get the recordings. You'll get to participate live in the class. The link I am providing right here. It's also pinned here. So all super chats I do get answered, but I keep a list. Sorry, I don't think I said that explicitly this one. Let's see. I should probably. Actually, you know what? I do need to. I'll just, because we're talking about Mormonism today, I'll answer them in the same one. Okay, so you asked, do you use genetic arguments against Mormons? Do you think they're a double-edged sword, given the bottleneck the Noachian family is supposed to have gone through? So as for genetic arguments, here's my position. As to whether the Lehites would have preserved their genetic signature in modern Native Americans if they had assimilated into a large Native American population, I don't know. What the genetic evidence does rule out is that all Native Americans are descended from Israelites. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the argument that we need to be having is textual, in that I think that's what the Book of Mormon describes. I think it's very clearly what it describes. I think it very clearly rules out the idea that there are indigenous outsiders into whom the Lehite population is assimilating. Now, Simon Southerton and has made the argument that the Lehite genetic signature should still be there, even if it was just a tiny contribution to the gene pool. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. I just don't have the expertise. But I think the narrative that the Book of Mormon describes, where Native Americans, by and large, are descended from Israelites, I think that is clearly false. And Latter-day Saints admit that's false. It's just they try to reread and kind of mold the Book of Mormon so that it means something else. So I think the argument we need to be having is textual. I agree with Earl Wonderly in his book, an imperfect book, which is that people can get caught in crossfire between experts on these technical questions, but the text of the Book of Mormon just doesn't say what LDS scholars try to make it say, because they need to make it say something different than what I think it was intended to mean. That's how I would get at that. And then I would also say that if there's no genetic signature, if there are in fact were Native Americans who were present prior to Lehi, were the majority of the population, and the Lehites assimilated into this Native American culture, and then all of Lehi's descendants forgot about their Lamanite past, the Book of Mormon has no point, because the Book of Mormon is written as an instrument for the gathering of Israel. It is written to remind the Lamanites that they are Lamanites, so that they can be part of the gathering of Israel. The promise of Moroni, I would enjoin you to pray and see if these things are true, and the Holy Ghost will give you a confirmation thereof, that's written to the Lamanites. It's interesting to me the way that this motif appears in the Book of Mormon and the way it appears in Smith's later theology, by the way. I haven't seen any Mormon note this, but this idea that, okay, there's the origin of these people is in God's covenant, but then they forget about their identity. They need to be reminded of their identity so that they can return to God. That's the narrative of the pre-mortal to mortal to post-mortal life, that we were with God once, we passed through a veil of forgetfulness. The gospel reminds us of who we really are so we can return to God. And that also relates to the question about Gnosticism someone asked, because this is part of the Gnostic narrative too. Mormonism isn't exactly Gnostic, but it has analogies to it. This idea of an innate divine potential. Well, Mormons would say it's true for all human beings. Gnostics would say some people have a divine spark in them. Some people have a core to them which pre-existed as part of God and must return to God. That narrative structure is present in Mormonism. It's interesting the way that it parallels the narrative structure of the Book of Mormon, the gathering of Israel, and so on and so forth. Someone else, how fits the Mormon Transhumanist Association and the pursuit of theosis on Earth? So I don't know that much about the Mormon Transhumanist Association. I've seen it, but it does seem to me that the basic kind of principle is something which is very deeply rooted in LDS theology, which is that our exaltation, our glorification is something that we acquire through obedience to certain inherent natural laws, such that, I mean, I agree with what one gentleman here said, and that, scrying is real. I agree that scrying is real. But the idea behind magic and behind natural magic and behind a lot of the sciences is really not all that different. It's about certain qualities which are said to inhere in natural objects. And I would say that that's the basic principle underlying the Mormon concept of exaltation and transhumanism. Okay. So, let's see. So for those who are interested, I'll link that's the link to the class. You can sign up for the class at that link I've just posted. It's $120 for about 12 hours total, 1 hour over 12 classes. Over a period of 6 weeks. That'll start in about mid-January. I do prefer that if you're planning to sign up, that you do it earlier rather than later, just so I get a sense of who's going to be there, and so I can kind of craft the class with those people in mind and pick times appropriately and so on. But please consider signing up. It's on answering Protestant objections to Orthodoxy and Catholicism in large part. From the Bible. And someone asked when the last day to sign up for the classes will be. Well, I'll keep the sign up open pretty much until the classes end, and I'll just give you the recordings if we've already started. But yeah, the class will be recorded, and you'll get access to the recordings if you sign up. And if you sign up after I start the classes, of course, you'll get access to all the recordings. And I may well just keep the sign up thing open in perpetuity and just allow people to buy the recordings that way. But if you're planning on signing up, my personal preference would be that it would be sooner rather than later. But of course, there's all things that everyone needs to consider as to their own situation, whatever. So yeah. So anyway, thank you for coming today. I ask that you all remember me in your prayers, that you commemorate me, Seraphim, in the Divine Liturgy, that you also remember Magdalena in your prayers and commemorate her in the Divine Liturgy as well. So with all of that said, I will see you by God's will on, I believe, Monday. So I will see you then. Bye.